Hi, this is Matt Caffrey back again. Good morning. Welcome back, everybody. As I've said before, one of the great joys of being able to MC connections year after year is I get to introduce some really remarkable people and folks. It's just an honor to work with. And Lieutenant General Richard Keller is just someone who has done so much for the United States and so much for our friends and allies over the years. General Keller has been uh, uh, deployed Korea, Vietnam. There's only so many of those guys left. Germany. His education and training as he was coming up in the Army reflected a future emphasis on jointness, in that he went to school both in Newport and at Carlisle. And I think partially because of that and everything else, his concluding assignment was Chief of Staff, U.S. European Command. That's a joint headquarters, Army, Air Force, Navy, Marines. And not only joint, but his work coordinated the efforts of 83 nations in Eastern and Western Europe, the Middle East, North Africa, just an incredibly impressive career. And then, like so many in the military, when he retired, he didn't really retire. He continued working, creating wargaming and trading sims for the military. And he's going to be talking to us about some of the work that he did with wargaming when he was on duty. And, you know, with connections, we tend to focus on what's the newest thing and what's the latest technology. But we need to remember this has been going on for a while. We're coming around up on the 200th anniversary of wargaming, and General Keller will be telling us a little bit about how, well, maybe the technology changes, the application endures. General, it's an honor, a privilege, and a great joy to introduce you. You're on, sir.
Well, thanks, Matt. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for the introduction, and thanks for a guy in the background, Merle Robinson, who's the guy that's keeping a lot of the technology going that lets us do what we're doing here today. When Colonel Lord asked me to think about making a presentation here, I thought it might be, what came into mind for me was I had experienced in my career things in wargaming, and I could share those with you and see if any of those apply today. So that's sort of the trip that I'm going to take you through. With regard to having a great career as a general officer, the period of time I was in was a time when the draft ended and we went to VOLAR and then to women in the Army and then to a 70% married Army. And a third of my career was as a major because promotions were frozen, and a third of my career was as a general officer. So those were turbulent times. If you want to keep your humility in place, though, as a general officer, my wife was driving on post in our 1993 Ford Explorer with 326,000 miles on it. And when she showed her ID card, they said that she could get the ID card corrected. It said LTG, which meant Lieutenant General, and get it corrected to LTC, which is Lieutenant Colonel. So everybody's trying to help generals get their ID cards corrected as they serve around in life. I understand you're a very diverse audience, and you're made up of military and veterans and civilians. And so for those of you in the military and veterans, thanks for your service. And for all of the civilians that supported all of the military over the time, that was very important to us. So I thank you for that. My experience is going to be mainly military. And so I'm going to share that with you. And it's what I experienced. It's not written in doctrine. It's not some manual someplace. It's not a book that I wrote or anything of that nature. It's what I experienced about what the building blocks for simulations were and how we used them during my time in the Army. I've not fully attended all of the prior presentations. I did watch your introduction, Matt. I did see General Hill, and I did see Dr. French, and a little bit of some others. So I'm not trying to dovetail my remarks with all of the prior remarks, although you're going to find some of the things I say have been said before. So take the ones that are useful to you, discard the others, ask me questions about things that I'm going to get through with you, and I'll do the best I can to keep us on time and be relevant to what it is your interests are. I want to show you that, in my opinion, war games that I experienced played a major role in reshaping the Army and, in some cases, the Air Force and the doctrine. It reshaped it in how it trained, how it educated, and how it fought in wars that I experienced as a result of gaming. It's important to understand that the challenge to the Army and all of the services is that what comes into the Army and the other services each year comes off of the streets of America. So all of the great and wonderful and noble and talented things that come off of America's streets and high schools and come into the military also bring with them values and behaviors and things that are not what we want in the military as well. And so the military, when it brings people on board, has to train them in an occupational specialty. But in addition to that, it has to then educate them in things that are behaviors in the military which are or not acceptable. I saw this morning on TV the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff in testimony to Congress explaining why at West Point they're teaching things about race and behavior and things of that nature because of problems in the military. And if you think about that, that's not too far from some of the ethical behaviors we'd like to see. The military is always looking for ways to accomplish that training and education. And I happen to think that a group like yours is very valuable and would be able to assist the military in doing that. I'm not a war gamer. I'm not a game designer, but I've participated in so many games that myself and others kind of know what right looked like when we saw it. And then based on all of what I saw and what I did when I became director of training for the Army, I provided the fund for the gaming simulator, or what was called CBS, Core Battle Simulation, and BBS, Brigade and Battalion Simulation. So as people showed up and they wanted to show me a bunch of eye candy and explosions on the screen, that turned me off. You'll see from what I experienced that I was looking more for task conditions and standards and doctrines in wargaming. I didn't do all of this alone over the years. I did it assisted by great people, not unlike yourselves. And the goal was to train individuals and units. So you had individual training and collective training. I'd like to share some of the principles I learned from that. And then after I've shared those with you, tell you what I think might apply to the future. At the conclusion, I'm going to ask your opinion about wargaming, particularly ethics wargaming. Is it possible? Who's doing it? What are the standards? How are you measuring things? Are some of you doing things already that might be useful to the military? And how do you get those before the military and let them look at it to see if they'll be helpful? Let me start by sharing a few charts that show the first war games that I became familiar with. And then I'll follow with some charts that show what my experience was over time in gaming simulation. Could I have that first wargaming chart, please? First one that I became familiar with was called First Battle. And like has been discussed, it consisted of a white cell, a blue cell, and a red cell. So the blue cells would be in the field. That would be the division and corps commanders and others, and their command posts would be out in the field doing what they're doing. And the red and the white cells, the white cell was the exercise director and the staff that ran the game. And usually in the same gymnasium, but with a screen in between you on the other side of a table, was the red cell, which was playing all of the doctrine of the opposing forces. And so the size of the cell depended upon the size of the exercise you were doing. And In addition to what you've seen here is sort of an Army graphic training aid, there were some rules for doing that. Could I see the next slide, please? These gave some rules of the game, and they were labor intensive, but once you knew the rules of the game about how artillery shot, maneuver worked and everything, then underneath that there were some optional rules which gave you some modifications to that. And all of that tried to incorporate as much variety of the battle as they could put into a gaming simulation. You see, that was 71 pages of rules that applied to the game. So you need some gamers that understood how to do this. Can I have the next slide, please? This one's a bit busy, but it really puts the counters on the board. And what I'm talking about is this. To play first battle, if you were a brigade commander, you had 3 cutouts that were battalions. If you had artillery in support, you had little cutouts that got stacked on the board that was artillery. And so the entire force structure was made up of layouts like this, where you had the white cell and the blue force players and the red force players, and all of these little cutouts and game turns and clocks and kind of a slow motion adjudication of battles that had their outcomes with referees and others figuring all of that out. It was sometimes criticized for taking a lot of overhead, but the overhead people learned gaming and simulation and stuff as well. They learned gaming and tactics and training and doctrine and synchronization and after action reviews. So if you think about just setting this up, and if you think about measuring it against doctrinal standards, and if you think of sort of a slow motion battle that would probably go slower than actual battles would, it was a bit cumbersome, but it nonetheless was my first introduction to wargaming. And usually I played it at division and corps level. You can take that chart off, please. No, I don't need this one yet. First battle was complex. It was labor intensive. It was difficult to set up. It was difficult to run. It was slow. It was difficult to determine resolution. So it was a very low resolution game. But for the first time, it replicated doctrine. It evaluated war plans. It synchronized fighting systems. It showed weaknesses and provided after-action review results that were usable. It always involved the right key players and decision makers. And it was adaptable. You could make changes that improved the game. You could make changes that improved doctrine. You could make available after-action reviews that permeated all of the battle operating systems on the battlefield and decided if air or ground or artillery, all of these systems needed changes or got feedback. So the entirety of the Army that had to do with battles was simulated in first battle. Well or poorly, this is a bit of an oversimplification, but they were there and people were working on it. It was also largely non-proprietary, and what I mean by that is no business owned it. So you could make the changes in the adaptations pretty readily. And it didn't have some $1 million software kernel in the middle of it, which would preclude you from using the game unless you paid a king's ransom to get it playing the game. As the Vietnam War was ending in the 1970s, there was an Arab-Israeli war in the desert, And on that battlefield, in very short time, were massive armored and mechanized casualties. It was startling. And it startled the Army, and it startled NATO, and it startled Army Europe, because we had been coming out of lots and lots of years of Vietnam and jungle warfare. And what became apparent to the senior leadership of the military and to the NATO allies is that on the plains of Europe, the Warsaw Pact might be capable of doing something similar that they saw on the desert warfare in the Arab-Israeli War. Could I have my first chart of my assignments, please? What I'd like to discuss here, first of all, is some leaders. You can see Keller was there at the engineer school. I was an infantry officer. I was teaching the leadership, the training management. And one of the things that I became familiar with was General Depew, who's off to the right there. And Depew, I worked in Division G3 of 1st Infantry Division in Vietnam when he was the division commander. His G3, his operations officer, was Lieutenant Colonel Gorman, and the 11th ACR commander was Colonel Don Starry. So these three gentlemen, Depew and Gorman and Starry across the top there, have come out of experiences together in Vietnam. But now when the Army reformed itself coming out of Vietnam, it divided the US forces in America into the forces that go to war, that was Forces Command, and into those that were training people to go to war, and that was Training and Doctrine Command, TRADOC. Depew becomes the CG of TRADOC, his chief trainer. Gorman becomes his training and doctrine proponent, and at the Armor Center is General Starry. Now there's a thing there, it says Systems Engineering and Army Training. The Army required all schools to do a soldier's manual for every soldier that listed all the tasks and conditions and standards by which they did their job. NCOs were even tested on that. So you had, for the first time, if you're an infantry guy, you had to learn a certain set of things. Then there was a set of task conditions and standards for squads, and then a set of task conditions and standards for platoons, and RTEP mission training plans, task conditions and standards for battalions and brigades and corps. And so even though I was at the engineer school, I became very familiar with the system that the Army across the entire organization was showing an ability to put measurable standards online to learn how soldiers should do their jobs and how units should do their jobs. Complementing that, would you put the last slide up again, please? Complementing that, if you didn't see it around at the right bottom, it says 100-5. The Army published its first, and this is an oversimplification, it had published its first doctrinal manual, and it was mainly an offensive tactics manual and for all operations, and it was written mainly by General Depew and a bunch of people called the Boathouse Gang, together with General Starry and Fort Leavenworth, put this manual out. It was the first time that a doctrinal manual was put together to try and fight the war in Europe. So Keller becomes familiar with all of that stuff as a major at the engineer school. Would you put up my second chart, please? Again, if you look at this one, you can see that General Depew has retired, and that Gorman has become the CG of 8th Infantry Division, and Keller's serving as the G3, the operations in the division, and that the TRADOC, the commander of TRADOC, the CG of 5th Corps, I'm sorry, it becomes General Starry. So these three senior people that have now put this together in TRADOC are now over in Europe going to put together first battle, war plans, doctrine, and war game them in the European theater. War game there were the defense plans for the Fulda Gap or the Meiningen Gap, wherever your battle was going to be fought and by whichever corps, those plans got put into first battle and you played them. What happened on the first plays is that you always took care of the first 2 or 3 echelons that attacked you, but you had a problem that there was a third and a fourth and a fifth echelon that kind of determined the outcome of the battle. And so a group of things were put together, which kind of had the name of 10 divisions in 10 days. And what that meant is, as a battalion and brigade commander, I had a battalion and a brigade's worth of equipment in the Netherlands that I could fly into and man and then get to the battle position and try and fight a war. And so that was called Reforger, Return of Forces to Germany. So in the United States, if you were in a organization that was war game to go to Europe or battle line to go to Europe, you then went through this drill of getting on an exercise airplane, flying into the Netherlands, drawing your equipment and getting there to fight the battle. That was again war gamed in first battle, product improved force battle. And again, you couldn't defeat all the echelons. So we went to a doctrine called active defense, which was, let's play this game, but let's give up space for time and retreat back through Europe. And as soon as all of these forces would be in place from America, we could then fight our way back over all that terrain and try and defeat the opposing force. That wasn't politically feasible. Who wanted to give up all, if you're a NATO country, who wanted to give up all of that country in NATO to fight over it and then fight back? So you put all of that in first battle and you played it again and again and again. And a key thing here that I saw is a thing called terrain walks. And it meant this: the Corps commander, in this case, General Starry, would go out and meet you on your battle positions. You would tell him exactly how you were going to fight the Fulda Gap fight, and he would go to the next location, all the logisticians, everybody else. They would then put all of that into first battle, and they would play it. And again, you had problem with all of the follow-on echelons. Unless you involved what became air-land battle, and you asked the Air Force to provide close air support for the battle for the first echelons, and then to strike deep at follow-on echelons and just either destroy them or defeat them or delay them or do something that allowed you to fight the first battle, bring reinforcements in, have enough armor systems bought and tow missile systems bought to kill what you could do on the field, and still have a prospect of an outcome that was successful to you. So that then when I went on to be director of training in the Army, and if somebody wanted me to buy a battle simulation that had a bunch of explosions on the screen and wanted me to get excited about that, I remembered all of the task conditions and standards. I remembered all the doctrine. I remembered all of the battles fought and measured against doctrinal standards, not the personality or the rank of the person present, but measured against measurable standards. I wanted to see a simulation that provided those kinds of things in a simulation. And that's what was my background for buying CBS and BBS. Now, out of all of these battles, the results were hitched to what became DOTMO-PF, that is doctrine, organization, training, material, logistics, personnel, and facilities. Probably should be another F there that said finances as well. all of the results of these games were hitched to Army processes that bought those kind of things and had the Army heading in the same direction, and as I've suggested, the Air Force as well. It validated your doctrinal approach to your general defense war positions. Air was added to first battle so that you could adjudicate Air Force rules and regulations as well. Eventually, the combat training centers at Grafenwehr, at Hohenfels, and then at Fort Polk and the National Training Center out at Fort Irvine, California, did the live portions of these battles, which gave richness to your lethality and allowed you to put that into the war games as well. So lessons learned out of live things could be added to it. All of these were measured against doctrines and standards. Okay, chart 2 can come off and you're off. Okay, so what did I learn in all of this? And what might, you can take that one off, thank you. And so what did I learn from all of this? And what might be useful for wargaming, for ethics, and at this particular time? I don't know whether you've seen it, but there's a recent tasker that the Secretary of Defense sent out to all services to try to rectify some of the behaviors that are going on in the military. In fact, I looked on the 21st of June, just a day or so ago, and here's what the Army USA put out and said that the Secretary of Defense had said, "Whatever we are doing is not working." Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin told the Senate Armed Services Committee about sexual assault and harassment and prevention programs. "We need to do something else," he said. "We are losing the confidence of our junior enlisted soldiers and personnel and officers because we have yet to make significant progress against the challenges we face." So there is always a need in the Army to figure out better ways to get people excited about do things. And simulations, I think, is a way that we could do that. In its introduction to this year's conference, Matt Caffrey said, "Why wargaming and why connections?" One answer would be to assist the military and its services and the Department of Defense. General Hill also mentioned this in his introduction to this conference. There's a recent ethical war game that was fought here by Dr. Rich McConnell at Fort Leavenworth, and he had about 60 students that did case studies on ethical situations and about 60 students that did a war game on the same. And then they applied the standards at the tail end to a situation. Both did well, but those that had gone through the ethical war game seemed to have a better grasp and an ability to apply the principles. Excuse me. Now, my comments are an oversimplification of that. Both groups did do well. And you can study Dr. McConnell's results if you want at the school. So, well, in conclusion, here are some considerations for wargaming that I would suggest to you. From my experience, war games, it seems to me, need to do some of the following, not necessarily in the particular order. Simulations need a purpose. They need a goal that they're going to achieve, if that's to fight your battle for war, whatever it is. And the reason I say that is sometimes it gets so large and unmanageable, you can't use it. Define a purpose and goal. They need a clear understanding of the decisions that are to be made in the simulation. What is it you want people to decide in there? They need a clear understanding of the information to be used. What is the medium that you're going to be doing? Is it war? Is it ethics? Whatever. They need a system for evaluating the results that are measured against doctrine and standards not against the personalities of the people that either put the game or the loudest voice in the room. They need a system for collecting lessons learned and shared that can be integrated back into all of the systems involved. They should be user-friendly and not require massive overhead or upkeep. But as I mentioned early, overhead, people learn as well. One of your presenters in an earlier remarks, I think his name was Mr. Bay, said that as an enlisted soldier, they played Dun Kemp and had fun at it. If you can make these games fun and enjoyable and challenging, his words, it seemed to me, are good advice. They should be adaptable to upgrades and to lessons learned. They need not be perfect. We are not trying to build an F-16 cockpit. We want something that's got 70 or 80% resolution, and experts around and senior mentors and others can fill in the difference. They should be objectively reviewed by individuals or groups that point out their flaws and weaknesses. In other words, they need to be red teamed. What's wrong with this game? Why won't it work? What's its flaws and what can we do to fix it? There's a little game that I'll mention to you that is an example of what I'm saying. Colonel Lord and Jim Sterrett and Mike Dunn here hosted a group of businessmen from Kansas City who wanted to come out and visit Fort Leavenworth. And I said, well, what do you want to see? Some of them were businessmen that wanted to know how do you run the fort, what are the finances worth, and so on. But most of them evolved into how do you train leaders and how do you get them to think about different things. And so in the little skunk works department downstairs here at Fort Leavenworth, those three played a game called Quartermaster, and some of you are probably familiar with it, where there are people from who are playing who replicate the US and Italy and Germany and Japan and Russia, for example. And it's a little desktop, and it has some cards and some dice and some things you roll. And people who play pick up those particular countries, and then you start the game. And some of you are going to build navies, and some of you are going to build armies, but you need ports to do that and everything. But there are consequences for what you do. And pretty soon these people are so engaged in the game, they start talking with the accents that are Russian and Italian, and they're going at it big time. And what they realize is they are studying the strategy for World War II and what the buildup and the consequences and the outcome of that. And that students here can play a game similar to that if you put in Iraq or Afghanistan or another country and learn from one another and learn principles and things out of a simple little game that's at a desktop with some people that are orchestrating it for you. They get you to look at the consequences of things that you're going to do. I even meet some of those businessmen now and then, and out of the visit to Fort Leavenworth, the thing they always remember is the game. Now, you're the gaming experts, and so I ask you, how should the military develop these ethical war games? What can we learn from ethical professionals about gaming and content like yourself? What's out there that can be adapted that you've got now that could be used? Let me hear your thoughts and take your questions. Thank you. I got it. Your first battle was a major step forward. What other gaming tools do you think helped the Army gaming move forward? I guess what I would say is what I saw was that at various military installations throughout the Army, every installation built a gaming center of some sort. And they, the ability to have these games not to be first battle at big and that labor intensive, it allowed the Army at all of its installations, whether they were in TRADOC or FORCECOM. All of these people could put together their game for their unit and their particular circumstances with some people that helped them play that. And the other thing, which I think is a partial answer to your question, is as director of training for the Army, I sent the money to TRADOC. And they sent it to Orlando, where the software writers wrote the stuff. And then it came here to National Simulation Center at Fort Leavenworth. And they would put it on the screen, and there'd be an armor guy and an aviator guy and an artillery guy. And they'd say, that's not the way helicopters fly or tanks drive. And so this big circle in do loop allowed the simulations to get better and better and better. And they didn't get fielded until they had been validated by the Army's National Simulation Center. Out of that do loop came a whole series of smaller games and supporting things that you could do at installations, which then permeated the Army. General Vono was the Chief of Staff of the Army when I was the Director of Training, and he would go out and visit the combat training centers and these installations to see what other games could be played there. And what I think exploded were, by the time CBS and BBS and these other big games got modified, they got so adaptable that if you went to the combat training center at Fort Irwin, you could have one battalion in the box, put your brigade CP here, and play another one in computer simulation, which was some sort of an add-on that the National Training Center had put to BBS, for example, that allowed the brigade and battalion simulation to be done on NTC terrain and let you fight a brigade battle, even though you had one battle in the box. So you had live and virtual and constructive blossoming. I think the fact that the Army had all of these systems connected to each other allowed a bunch of little supplemental gaming simulations to pop up and serve local installations. Some of those became standardized and some of those did not. But I think it was the fact that the gamers permeated the Army. I'd add one more thing. I've noticed at the Command and General Staff College here that especially, I think it's a 59, maybe it's a 57, officers come now through course that are gaming simulation experts. It becomes their career field. They might have started in a different branch, but they are now inculcated into the Army system, which allows them to, if I'm a division commander and I'm wanting to do a gaming simulation, I can now have a guy on my staff or gal that's a gaming expert that can hitch me to the games that I want to play to do the things that I can think, that I can want to do. At the school here, the fact that you have Lord and Starrett and Dunn downstairs in the basement, if a professor wants to do something in a classroom that needs a gaming simulation, they can go down to these guys and say, what's the purpose? What are the decisions you want made and what's the information? And they'll put something together for them. So that's a long wandering answer, but I think the fact that it exploded throughout the Army kind of means that that same kind of stuff I think could happen from what I've seen from your few presentations I've seen, that would allow the Army to do something similar with regard to ethical wargaming. What advantages do you see to manual games like First Battle versus digital games like those used in Our Current Warfighters? I felt that First Battle fed and improved and made viable CBS and BBS, the computer-driven simulations. And what you needed, though, is all sorts of little proprietary headquarters popped up and tried to take control of things. The fact that it was part of a system and First Battle was used to improve the CBS war game, the core battle simulation, Core battle simulation could not have happened without First Battle. But now I think we can get away from the fact that they don't all need to be computer driven. You can do Quartermaster, and you can do some of the simulations which you people do that don't need a computer driving them. You just got some subject matter experts around there, and they've got a little tabletop exercise that can get you even talking with accents like Italians and Russians if you get excited enough about the game. You use the term game freely and with enthusiasm. What do you think that term game now seems to have bad connotations among the current upper ranks? I do not know what the current upper ranks think about the term game, but in the part of the Army that I was in when I grew up, this was serious business. And there were jokes about it and who was a better gamer and all that sort of stuff. But you knew that there was some reality connected to it. And the term of game took on the reality of serious business. And I know here, the leadership at Fort Leavenworth and other places I'm associated with gaming, whether it's tabletops or computer driven, or whether it's live, virtual, or constructive, it's all in a way a game to fight the war. It's serious business, and the joking and the thinking about it in among the Army leadership right now, I'm not familiar with, but I know here at Fort Leavenworth in the classrooms that I sit in as they do war games and the Art of War scholars, this is treated as key terrain, vital stuff, not to be thought of as a game that some kids are playing or not. On the other hand, let me add this. I have some grandchildren that are doing games, and those are the young men and women that are going to be coming into the armed forces. And so they've got gaming things that I never dreamed about. And so you out there in the field probably are more familiar with that than I am. And there's a transition that will go from game to real game that this installation and its students will always have to come to grips with. But I don't see things written by the senior leadership in doctrinal manuals that I read or Army magazines or good reviews of gaming and stuff. I don't see it thought of as some sort of a corny game or something not to be taken seriously. If they don't play well on their own merits, because they don't either replicate doctrine or measure real standards or something, then they may be just called more of a game than something that's more worthwhile. Do you see a need for more OSD joint staff sponsored games to examine global operations? Amen. And that's a tough one. I think as I was talking to Colonel Lord earlier, what I was doing was the 7 battle operating systems we had when I was on active duty. Now, as I talk to students in the classroom and I look at the things they're doing, there's multi-domain operations with everything from cyber to drones to things that I didn't have to robotics to things that I didn't have to do with. But those things can be added in, and those things can be part of what it is that the Army is going to take on and the other services as well. But in my case, if you couldn't do it with the ground forces and you needed the Air Force, it kind of drove you to the Air Force, and you needed close air support and you needed deep support. I do not see future wars being fought by one component of the military services. I think it's going to be joint, and I think you're exactly right with your question. And I'm not enough of an influencer to see any way to make that happen, but I agree with you that there's a real need for it. And I believe the Army's leadership believes that as well. Okay, I don't see any other questions out there from anybody. Thanks very much for your time today. Thanks for all you're doing. God bless.